as a sequel to Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. The Ubisoft Montreal team wanted to take the existing gameplay of the Prince of Persia games into a more open world approach and conceptualize its narrative as an assassin who served as a bodyguard for the prince and worked towards the throne rather than being born or next in line for the throne. In the beginning, the team had developed this into what would be known as Prince of Persia Assassin, but Ubisoft felt that a Prince of Persia game that didn't allow players to experience the game from a perspective of a prince would not serve well as a sequel, but should be spun off into a franchise of its own. Taking the parkour elements and combat from the Prince of Persia games, the Montreal team took advantage of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360's hardware capabilities, which allowed them to render large open spaces and crowds for players to interact in, and weaved in the century-old narrative of assassins and Templars with the help of a device that could render genetic memory in three-dimensional space, heavily borrowing a lot from the aspects of the novel Alamut by Vladimir Bartol, which told of the Hashashins and provided the franchise with the phrase, "Nothing is true and everything is permitted." The name Assassin's Creed would stick. The team quickly began laying the foundations for what would be one of the most essential genre-defining games of the decade. Being a revelation in 2007, Assassin's Creed debuted with the 12th century Levant during the Third Crusade and introduced players to Altair ibn Lahad. The game allowed players to explore cities throughout the Holy Land as Altair, and gave players the ability to effortlessly free roam the medieval landscape, fight guards and enemies through precise timings and counters. Being a game about assassins, Altair could gently push through hordes of crowds to avoid raising suspicion, and by keeping his head bowed and his hands together, he was able to bypass guards and defenses by performing actions that were socially acceptable and didn't attract attention. Eagle Vision provided players with key targets and important information such as the character's intentions by highlighting them in specific colors, but only allowed for its activation when Altair was standing perfectly still. Viewpoints were climbing puzzles that revealed parts of the map when traversed and made exploration a key component in the games to come. Each chapter in the story gave players a set of investigations that they must perform in uncovering their target's weaknesses before finally getting to assassinate them. Being a complete surprise to most, if not all players, the modern day led players to follow Desmond Miles, a bartender, and his experience through the memories of his ancestor Altair after being kidnapped by the modern Templars, known as Abstergo Industries. As a test subject for the Animus, a device that rendered genetic memory in three-dimensional space, Desmond begins experiencing what is known as the bleeding effect, and begins to use Eagle Vision due to his time in the Animus. A year after the launch of the first Assassin's Creed, the original team would list out the 10 creative commandments for future teams to base their game off. Number 1. Assassin's Creed will always tell the story of the secret wars between assassins and Templars. Number 2. Being an assassin doesn't make the main character a ruthless killer. He kills, but has principles and never murders innocents. He avoids collateral damage as much as possible. Number 3. The war between assassins and Templars is the foundation of our franchise story in past and present. Number 4. The assassin should always be agile, socially skilled, unbeatable with a blade, and a stylish badass. Number 5. Pivotal moments in human history are a basis for our franchise. Assassin's Creed will always take a revisionist approach on real events. We'll use historical gaps to create our story. History should always be portrayed as relevant to our core audience, with facts that tie into the present day, common knowledge, and edgy modern art direction. Number 7. Assassin's Creed is based on technology. Nothing is magical. Everything has a plausible technological explanation. Number 8. Assassin's Creed is about digging into a character's past through their DNA in order to understand what really happened in key historical moments. Number 9. Since the player relives the deeds of his kin through his DNA, the IP cannot be set in the future. DNA of unborn people does not exist. Number 10. Assassin's Creed can bend historical accuracy, but cannot create a Uchronia. In early February of the following year, a prequel for Assassin's Creed was released for the Nintendo DS titled Altair Chronicles. The prequel would follow Altair before the events of the first game, and received a port to mobile devices by publisher Gameloft in April of 2009. 2 years after the first Assassin's Creed, Ubisoft finally gave players a confirmation that a sequel was in the works, and released a spin-off game for the PSP titled Bloodlines in January of 2009. This spin-off would follow Altair a month after the events of the first game and resembled more in terms of its gameplay and graphics to the first Assassin's Creed rather than its DS prequel.
I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also was a chasing after wind, for in much wisdom is much grief. And he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. Destroy it! Destroy it as you said you would.
I can't.
Yes, you can, Altair. But you won't. We've got it.
What the hell is that? God. Looks like... Is that blood? The hell were they keeping here before me? And what happened to him? What does it mean, I wonder?
The direct sequel to Assassin's Creed 2, launched in November of 2009 and took place at the ending of the first game. Players were once again thrown into the shoes of Desmond Miles as he escapes from Abstergo Industries with the help of Lucy Stillman, an assassin who is working undercover as an Abstergo employee. Meeting up with the other modern-day assassins, Sean Hastings and Rebecca Crane, Desmond relives his memories of another ancestor, one who would become one of the most important assassins to come, Ezio Auditore da Firenze. Rebuilt and redefined, Assassin's Creed 2 brought players into the Italian Renaissance and followed Ezio from birth to adulthood. The newer Animus 2.0, gave players a database from within about its characters, key landmarks and events throughout the game. The sequel introduced an in-game economy in which players could loot dead enemies to purchase better armor, weapons, and even remodel and upgrade the Brotherhood's hideout in Monteriggioni. Combat presented players with newer enemies such as scouts that would chase Ezio, heavy brutes, and long-range seekers, which made players rethink their approaches when confronted with such enemies. Counterkills were improved with the inclusion of weaponry such as heavy and long-ranged, as well as twin hidden blades that concealed poison and a hidden gun. Eagle vision was also given an overhaul, with Ezio's ability to use it while on the move. The addition of medicine gave players the ability to heal during combat. Stealth was now more accessible, as players could now blend into crowds only by standing with them and pickpocket them for money, which could also be used to hire mercenaries to aid Ezio in fights, or courtesans to distract guards. However, the game's new notoriety system meant that players had to remove wanted posters, bribe heralds, or kill officials. Assassin's Creed 2's parkour also made way for Assassin Tombs, which were navigational puzzles that players could attempt in retrieving keys that would unlock Altair's armor under the Monteriggioni villa. Glyphs were scattered throughout Italy, gave backstory on the war between assassins and Templars, as well as implicating dozens of historical figures who would come into contact with pieces of Eden. With Desmond becoming ever more critical to an overarching narrative, the first look of those who came before revealed messages of an ancient civilization known as the Isu, warning him of an impending apocalypse to come.
Greetings, Prophet. It is good you have come. Let us see it, to give thanks. We must speak.
Who are you?
Many names. When I died, it was Minerva. Before that, Merva and Mera. And on and on. The others, too. Juno, who was before called Uni. Jupiter, who was before called Tinia.
You are... gods.
No, not gods. We simply came before. Even when we walked the world, your kind struggled to understand our existence. We were more advanced in time. Your minds were not yet ready. Still not. Maybe never. No matter. You may not comprehend us, but you will comprehend our warning. You must.
None of what you are saying makes sense.
Our words are not meant for you.
What are you talking about? There's no one else here.
Enough. I do not wish to speak with you, but through you. You are the prophet. You've played your part. You anchor him, but please be silent, that we may commune. Listen. When we were still flesh and our home still whole, your kind betrayed us. We who made you. We who gave you life. We were strong, but you were many, and both of us craved war. So busy were we with earthly concerns, we failed to notice the heavens. And by the time we did, the world burned until naught remained but ash. It should have ended then and there. But we built you in our own image. We built you to survive. And so we did. Few were our numbers. Your kind and mine. It took sacrifice, strength, compassion. But we rebuilt. And as life returned to the world, we endeavored to ensure this tragedy would not be repeated. But now, we are dying, and time will work against us. Truth turned into myth and legend. What we built, misunderstood. Let my words preserve the message and make a record of our loss. But let my words also bring hope. You must find the other temples, built by those who knew to turn away from war. They worked to protect us, to save us from the fire. If you can find them, if their work can be saved, so too might this world. Be quick, for time grows short, and guard against the cross, for there are many who will stand in your way. It is done. The message is delivered. We are gone now from this world. All of us. We can do no more. The rest is up to you, Desmond.
What? Who is Desmond? I don't understand. Please, wait. I have so many questions. What the fuck?
Set before the events of Assassin's Creed 2, Assassin's Creed Lineage was a live-action short film that was released on October of 2009 on YouTube that featured many, if not all, of the voice actors and actresses from the game, and followed Ezio's father, Giovanni, as he discovers the conspiracy against the Medici in Florence. In that same month, a novel titled Renaissance by Oliver Bowden was released and recapped the entirety of Assassin's Creed 2. The following November of 2010 continued the events of 2 with Brotherhood, and was the first in the franchise to offer a multiplayer mode. Following Ezio after the ending of 2, Brotherhood improved the gameplay on its predecessor and received a graphical overhaul in terms of its looks. Being the most significant addition to the franchise, the multiplayer in Brotherhood let players search and hide in crowds of lookalikes before tracking down their assigned targets and assassinating them. By looking and moving like a non-playable character to stay hidden meant that players were discouraged in free-running in view of other players. Brotherhood's addition of the crossbow as a long-range weapon and the ability to assign any of Ezio's weapons to one of 4 quick access buttons meant that players could now swap between weapons without having to open a menu to do so. Featuring a large portion of Rome, players could now call and ride a horse throughout city districts and let players renovate the entirety of Rome after taking out the head Templar in each controlled region. This combined viewpoints with assassinations. Civilians could now be recruited into the Brotherhood and used to help Ezio in combat encounters or set out across the globe to partake in missions. The introduction of Romulus layers replaced the assassin tombs from 2 and was scattered throughout Rome, in which keys were hidden throughout these layers that would unlock the armor and dagger of Brutus. The modern day expanded to let Desmond enter and exit the Animus at any time outside of memories and allowed him to interact with other modern day assassins and objects in their hideout beneath the modern day Auditory Villa in Monteriggioni. The newer Animus now allowed for the replay of missions and memories and allowed Desmond out of the hideout to collect 5 artifacts around Monteriggioni under a set timer. Brotherhood would also be the final game in which its creator, Patrice Désilets, would have any part in before he was fired from Ubisoft in June of 2010. In November of that same year, a short animated film titled Ascendance, taking place between the events of Brotherhood, was released on the PlayStation Store, Xbox Live and iTunes. The short movie detailed how Cesare Borgia rose to power and conquered all of Rome. In addition to that short film, a novel titled Brotherhood, written by Oliver Bowden, would release and recap the events that took place in Brotherhood. Originally a title for the Nintendo 3DS called Lost Legacy, Revelations would be reworked into a sequel to Brotherhood when Ubisoft announced that it would need more time before the next installment in the franchise would be completed. Following Ezio's final adventure to Masyaf, he travels to Constantinople to obtain the 5 memory seals needed to access Altair's library under Masyaf Castle. Following the shocking ending of Brotherhood, Desmond is stuck in a coma. He's forced to revisit the remaining memories of both Ezio and Altair as the mysterious Subject 16, who reveals himself to be Clay Kazmarek, an undercover assassin sent into Abstergo but went mad due to excessive prolonged hours in the Animus and painted the messages with his own blood in the room that Desmond finds himself in during his time at Abstergo, guides Desmond out of his coma. Arriving in Constantinople, an older Ezio meets up with the Turkish Brotherhood and obtains a few Eastern tools to his arsenal. The hook blade replaces Ezio's now broken right blade and allows him to climb higher, slide down zip lines, swing across lanterns, and trip up enemies. The Turkish Brotherhood also provided Ezio with an array of explosives and introduced players with a crafting system that allowed bombs to be created from an assortment of materials. These bombs allowed for lethal, tactical, and diversional specific explosives that could be used in encounters that required them. Ezio's ego vision had now evolved to what is known as ego sense, and allowed players to see guard patrol paths. The weapon wheel was also tweaked and split into 2 wheels, with one for primary weapons and another for secondary weapons. Guard factions now appeared in the world and would battle one another when they encountered each other. Revelations also does away with the locking of regions by allowing players to freely explore and access any part of Constantinople as soon as Ezio arrives. Building on the viewpoints of Brotherhood, the Templar dens in Revelations would occasionally be attacked once the assassins took them over and contributed to building up the Turkish Brotherhood in the city. Once taken over, players could assign an apprentice to the den, which would unlock assassination stories that took place in the world. The remainder of the Ottomans introduced the Janissaries that were elite troops who brought guns as they did swords, and would require several hits before going down. Those were not the only threats that Ezio had to face, as whispers throughout the world indicated if stalkers were nearby. While the tombs and layers from 2 and Brotherhood were merely side activities, except for 2, you had to do the tombs to obtain Altair's armor that Ezio had at the beginning of Brotherhood, obviously. The dungeons in Revelations were the only way to secure the 5 memory seals in Constantinople. These memory seals also revealed memories of Altair and gave players one last time to visit him in-game. Released a year later in February, The Lost Archives brought in first-person puzzles which followed Clay as Desmond relives his memories. Alongside it, the novel's Secret Crusade was the journal that Ezio had obtained in Marsyaf from the Templar captain and retold many aspects of Altair's life while being narrated by Niccolo Polo, father of Marco Polo. The novel Revelations would also launch with it, recapping the entirety of the game.
No books. No wisdom. Just you, fratello mio. Requiescat in pace, Altair. You have seen to my books?
Yes. Some we sent with the Polos. The rest will go with me to Alexandria.
Good. Very good.
Father, I do not understand. Why did you build a library if you did not intend to keep your books?
You should go. When the Mongols return, Masyaf must be empty.
I see. This is not a library at all. It is a vault.
It must stay hidden, Darim. Far from eager hands. At least until it has passed on the secret it contains.
What secret?
Go, son. Go be with your family. And live well.
All that is good in me began with you, Father.
In much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow.
What does it tell you? What do you see?
Strange visions and messages of ones who came before, of their rise and their fall.
But what happens to us, Altair? To our family? What does the apple say?
Who were the ones who came before? What brought them here? How long ago?
Get rid of that thing!
This is my duty, Maria. If you are asked, say I sent the apple away. Tell them I sent it to Cyprus or Cipango, or that I dropped it into the sea. Tell them anything to keep men away from this place. This apple must not be found. Not until the time is right. Another artifact. No. You will stay here.
I have seen enough for one life. Desmond?
He's talking to me?
I heard your name once before, Desmond. A long time ago. And now it lingers in my mind, like an image from an old dream. I do not know where you are, or by what means you can hear me. But I know you are listening. I have lived my life as best I could, not knowing its purpose, but drawn forward like a moth to a distant moon. And here at last, I discover a strange truth. And I am only a conduit for a message that eludes my understanding. Who are we, who have been so blessed to share our stories like this? Speak across centuries. Maybe you will answer all the questions I have asked. Maybe you will be the one to make all this suffering worth something in the end. Now, listen.
As a final goodbye to Ezio, the Montreal team decided to create and produce a short film titled Embers, which detailed the last days of Ezio as he retreats to a life of retirement but is called back to assist the Chinese Brotherhood. Xiao Yun makes her first appearance here as she arrives at Ezio's villa in Tuscany, aiming to rebuild her brotherhood. October of 2012 came, and the biggest shift for the series began with Assassin's Creed 3. Moving from Europe to the Americas, Assassin's Creed 3 introduced players to the Kenway bloodline and the newly upgraded Anvil engine that the franchise had been using up to this point as Anvil Next. The newer engine meant that Assassin's Creed 3 would have improved environmental effects such as seasonal changes, larger scaled battle scenes, and more detailed close-ups including animations that were made from scratch. With the Anvil Next, the controls were streamlined but took away many parkour elements from previous titles, such as the inability to cancel moves and combine them into a combo that would make certain areas easier and more efficient to reach. Players now had less control of the exact movements over their character, thus removing the risk and arguably fun of this intrinsic gameplay feature. The jump button still allowed for somewhat of a jump off buildings and rooftops should the player feel the need to. While earlier titles started players off as a young adult in the Holy Lands, or as a baby at birth during the Italian Renaissance, 3 surprised players by having its first few memory sequences with Hatham, Connor's father and the first playable temple. Connor, or Radon-Gahedon, would climb trees, investigate clues in the wilderness, and even hunt or trap wildlife for resources, which players could now use in the expanded crafting system. 3 introduced newer stealth mechanics such as hiding in tall bushes, moving hay carts, corners of buildings, which players could lure guards to the demise. Being animation based, the newer combat system gave Connor the use of dual melee weapons with a swivel blade. Yes, swivel blade, because that's not a hidden blade, in one hand and a tomahawk in the other. Connor could now utilize any secondary and ranged weapons seamlessly without having to pause like Ezio did. The inclusion of the rope dart allowed players to hang their foes from tree branches or yank them towards themselves, and muskets were disposable alternatives which could be repurposed to use as spears. Players could now pull an enemy nearby to protect themselves from gunshots, and if counters were correctly timed, a kill streak could be performed, eliminating multiple enemies at once. With the removal of armor upgrades and medicine, players now had to flee out of combat to regenerate their health automatically. Spanning the cities of Boston and New York, as well as the open-ended frontier, 3 did away with the tombs and layers of previous titles in favor of underground tunnel labyrinths and forts, which players could take over. One thing that 3 did bring back from previous titles was dubbed the Homestead, more prominent than the Monteriggioni Villa. The Homestead was much more of a character-driven community that should have been mandatory, as certain weapons and gear were locked behind certain characters which needed to be invited back to craft. The Brotherhood system also got a similar treatment, as each recruit had their own narrative set missions which Connor had to complete before indoctrinating them as assassins. This new Brotherhood system also replaced the courtesans, mercenaries, and thieves by allowing players to use members of the newly recruited Brotherhood as any of them. Assassin's Creed 3 was also the first in the series to offer full-on naval combat. While Brotherhood first dipped its toes in the Leonardo missions, 3 had naval missions with the Aquila, an upgradable ship that Connor used in a few memory sequences throughout the story. A novel titled Forsaken, detailing many of Haytham's previous journal entries, was released after the launch of 3. Being the final chapter in Desmond's story, Desmond had several modern-day sequences in which he would leave the Animus to complete missions, all while escaping the clutches of the infamous sleeper agent, Daniel Cross. And while the ending of 3 was deemed disappointing and premature by many, along with the plot seemingly focused as an American narrative rather than an assassin one, it was a sign that the worst was yet to come for the franchise.
Story now of how we tried, of how we failed, all our hopes extinguished, save one. Your touch, a spark to save the world.
Wait! Do not touch the pedestal.
Minerva?
You. But how? You left! You destroyed the device!
Did you think there was only one?
What the hell is going on here?
You must not free her.
Free her?
Juno dwells within these walls, awaiting release. I will explain. While we worked to save the world, she sought instead to conquer it. She used our machine to set her plans in motion. Divination through numbers. There is a pattern to existence. To comprehend the calculations is to tame time. This was my focus. And so I built the eye to aid us. But she turned it towards her own ends. When we discovered her treachery, we put a stop to it. And then we left. But first we called to you, that you might try again. We thought it would be safe with her gone. Now I see we were deceived. She survived, she endured, and then she began to work. For centuries, Tinny and I walked the world, hoping to rekindle the spark of civilization. We shared what we knew as best we could. We were not the only ones, but for all the power we wrought, still death would claim us. But before it did, I would have one last look to know if we had succeeded.
That's how you're here now?
I had hoped you might find this place and finish our work. But it is too late. You and the Templars have squabbled over our refuse. You have wasted centuries, and so you have lost your chance. You cannot hope to stop the end now, Desmond. Only to survive.
She's lying! Only touch the pedestal and the world will be saved.
Better the world burn than she be loosed upon it.
Is that so? Show him then.
But he will not understand. It is complicated. It is...
Show me.
If you heed Minerva, the sun will have its way. The ground will crack and spit fire into the skies. All the world will burn. But this does not end the world, merely heralds its arrival. Darkness follows. Then you emerge, resolving to lay a foundation that such a tragedy does not befall the world again. You will become a symbol to those who survive. Hope, knowledge, determination. You will inspire them to rebuild, to thrive once more. And as the world heals, so too will humanity. But you are just a man, frail and mortal. You pass from the world, leaving behind only a memory. A legacy. You will be remembered first as a hero, later as a legend, and in time, as a god. It is the cruelest fate, to have written words that meant well, and see them made wicked and unwise. What was meant to encourage life, used instead to justify taking it. And so now you see that what was shall be again. So tell me, how is this better? She would sacrifice you, sacrifice the world, for no other reason than to deny me vindication.
They will enslave your kind, Desmond. Is this not why you fight? Is this not why you came here? To ensure more than just your race's future, but its freedom?
What future? What freedom? Billions dead and the whole cycle begun anew? This world has known nothing but heartache and horror since we left it.
Our gift to them, and you'd see it all returned.
Enough!
You must not do this.
Whatever Juno's planning, however terrible it might seem today, we'll find a way to stop it. But the alternative, what you want, there's no hope there.
If you free her, you'll be destroyed.
It will happen in an instant. There will be no pain.
You mustn't.
It's done, Minerva. The decision's made.
Then the consequences of this mistake are yours to live and die with.
You need to go. All of you. Now. Get as far away from here as you can.
Come with us. We'll find another way.
There isn't time.
Son.
You know it's true. It's already started. I need to do this now. So go. Go!
The first game developed by Ubisoft Sofia for the PlayStation Vita, Liberation, was set around the end of the French and Indian War and took place sometime after the events of 3 and featured a nameless protagonist who had purchased a new VR video game from Sturger. Being the first female assassin, Aveline de Grand Prix would traverse the city of New Orleans and the swamp of the Louisiana Bayou. Taking ideas that had been initially conceived for 3, Liberation gave Aveline the ability to use a blowgun from haystacks and traverse the swamps with the use of a canoe, all of which had been cut by the time 3 was released. Liberation would also be the first and the last game to introduce multiple personas in which Aveline would change out of her assassin robes in favor of a dress or slave rags. These personas would act as disguises which the players could switch to and from by visiting a changing room scattered throughout the world, and would alter the behavior of guards and limit Aveline from moving or acting in socially unacceptable manners. Announced alongside Liberation, Assassin's Creed Pirates would be a mobile game developed by Ubisoft Paris, which focuses on naval combat from 3. Pirates would run on the web-based open source engine Babylon and follow Alonso Tala, a pirate on the hunt to find the treasure of Labuse in the early 18th century. The game would be pulled from both Play Store and App Store in late 2015. A year after the launch of Liberation, the first project held by Ubisoft Quebec, Tyranny of King Washington, was a 3-episodic expansion for Assassin's Creed 3, was set in an illusionary timeline in which George Washington forgot presidency to rule as a tyrannical king. This DLC took place sometime in 3 and showed what would happen when George Washington came into contact with an Apple of Eden. In this alternate universe, Connor never became an assassin and remained as Radon Gahedon after gaining abilities by drinking the Red Willow tea. Players gained abilities such as Eagle Flight, which allowed them to traverse the cities of New York and Boston from one building to another. These additions only added to the state that the already infamous ending of 3 had left fans in. After the ending of 3 left many with mixed feelings, the announcement that a 6th mainline entry in the franchise was coming a year later worried fans, as they and myself felt that with Desmond no longer serving as a link to the past, the series would suffer, but that concern would only prove to be a passing phase. Produced by the Montreal team with Ashraf Ismail and writer Darby McDevitt, who had written the amazing interweaving narrative of Revelations, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag would prove itself to be successful. Set during the golden age of piracy, players explored the life of Edward Kenway, grandfather of Connor and father to Haytham, throughout the Caribbean Sea, with major cities such as Nassau, Havana, and Kingston. As for the modern day, players witness the aftermath of Desmond's death, with Abstergo arriving at the Grand Temple to retrieve his body to further study his genetic memories through the eyes of an anonymous newly hired Abstergo Entertainment research analyst in a first-person perspective. Bringing naval as a primary focus, Black Flag let players sail the Jackdaw through the open seas, raid forts and capture ships, as well as explore uncharted islands for treasure. By using the spyglass, players could locate and target ships before firing off different types of cannon shot, before boarding it or blowing it to pieces and collecting the remaining loot that floated on the waves. The notoriety system extended from the land to sea, with pirate hunters going on the lookout for Edward. Captured ships could also be used in missions and sent out into the Caribbean. Taking inspiration from the crafting system in Far Cry 3, Black Flag would have a similar arrangement with holsters, health, and pouches being crafted by gathering resources and hunting wildlife in specific villages. That said, players could also hunt on sea with a whaling boat by harpooning sharks, whales, and other sea creatures, or use a diving bell to discover sunken treasure while avoiding said sharks. Black Flag was also the first to trade in the weapon wheel for a streamlined and easy to access inventory cross, made switching from pistols to smoke bombs that much quicker. Initially, the team conceptualized on bringing back the hook blade, but ultimately decided against it as they were aiming for a more historically accurate take on the era, which meant straying away from stereotypes associated with the period. The multiplayer in Black Flag would also prove to be the last in the series to include it, with added features that allowed players to create their own custom game modes and share it with their friends. A novel under the same name would be written and published that same year. Black Flag's DLC, Freedom Cry, gave players a chance to relive the memories of Adewale, the Jackdaw's former quartermaster, before turning into an assassin. Freedom Cry's most significant addition to Black Flag was the slave freeing mechanic, in which players could free slaves around Haiti that could be recruited to the Maroons in the fight against their French oppressors. That also meant that players had to limit their damage to enemy ships, as they had to be boarded to save the slaves on board. Instead of wielding dual cutlasses like Edward, Adewale was equipped with a machete and a blunderbuss, which could both be upgraded once a set number of slaves were rescued. However, many agreed that Adewale's turn to the Brotherhood did little for his character and made for an otherwise dull and mundane plot. However, Freedom Cry would not be the only DLC for Black Flag, as an Aveline DLC was released several months before Freedom Cry. The Aveline DLC would feature linear memory sequences that had Aveline travel to Rhode Island in search for Patient Gibbs, a slave which had possessed a Shard of Eden. A year after its release, Freedom Cry would go on to be released as a standalone game for those that did not purchase the Season Pass of 4. Not wanting to leave previous gen players without a game, with the release of next gen consoles, Ubisoft planned for 2 games to be released in 2014, with one of these games, codenamed Assassin's Creed Comet. With Ubisoft Sofia behind the development, Assassin's Creed Rogue would be announced alongside its next gen successor, and would be a bridge for one gen to the next in terms of its narrative. Combining the setting of 3 and the gameplay of Black Flag, Rogue would reverse the focus on the century-long war by putting players in the shoes of one, Shay Patrick Cormac, an assassin turned Templar. Viewing the conflict from the opposing faction's point of view meant that Shay's ship, the Morrigan, would be boarded, allies would be targeted for assassinations and stalked by assassins hiding in plain sight as players traverse the lands. With the Morrigan being smaller than Edward's Jackdaw and Connor's Aquila, it was far easier to control and navigate, with an array of different weaponry on board that could pierce ice sheets and set oceans on fire. Set after the events of 4 and before 3, Rogue showed us how the Brotherhood in the Americas was wiped out during the 7 Years' War and served as the final chapter in the Kenway saga. With New York being the only city in Rogue, Shay spent most of his time in the Hudson River Valley and the ice-cold regions of the North Atlantic. Continuing the ending of Black Flag's modern day, an anonymous Helix research analyst was tasked with reliving the memories of Shay in the first-person perspective. After sifting through Shay's memories awakens a virus on Abstergo Entertainment servers, the analyst is thrust out of the Animus by one of the members of the modern-day Templar Sigma team, Violet DaCosta. After meeting with Giovanni Otzoberg turned out to be part of a much larger plan, the analyst was set back to continue exploring Shay's memories. Following an earthquake caused by Shay's intervention of a Tree of Eden under the order of Achilles, Shay accused Achilles of being aware of the consequences and endangered the lives of innocents. And instead of listening and reasoning with Shay, Achilles' extremist ideals dismissed Shay, which caused him to steal the manuscript, a document capable of translating First Civilization language, and turned him to the Templars.
Achilles, I have to do this. And what is it you're doing exactly? Stealing from your brothers? Betraying me? Someone must make amends. Make amends? You have no idea what you're doing. The future of the whole continent, maybe the whole world, is tied up in that manuscript. Perhaps. But we don't have the right to decide that future. The right? We have the responsibility! We are responsible for killing innocents and destroying cities. This mad grab for power. It ends now. I will not let you destroy everything we have built!
With Templar resources now at hand, Shay was equipped with a silent air rifle that acted as a blowgun that could shoot darts and firecrackers, and would later receive a grenade launcher as an add-on. With smoke bombs and poison gas being used against him, players could now equip Shay with a mask that would prevent him from slowing down or being affected by them. Rogue being a Templar-focused narrative meant that previous assassination contracts were now assassination interceptions that saw players working to foil them instead. Bounty hunters would now track Shay down whenever his notoriety got too high. However, Rogue wouldn't be received very well, as some called it a clone of Black Flag, and ultimately didn't get as much attention as it could have as its next-gen counterpart. Rogue was also seemingly the first in the franchise not to receive a novel adaptation by Oliver Bowden or any other author. With the ending of Rogue being the beginning of Unity, fans were eager to see what a next-gen game in the franchise would look like. Enter the French Revolution. Exploring the memories of one Arnaud Victor Dorian, players were introduced as an anonymous Helix user before having their session interrupted by the modern-day assassins. Introducing a whole set of new changes, including the newer Anvil Next 2.0 engine, Unity rebuilt many of the core gameplay mechanics, such as combat, as players could now dodge gunshots and parry attacks instead of simply countering enemy attacks. With medicine making a return, instant healing meant that despite the new challenges posed by combat, it made it easier to adapt. Taking a page out of the RPG genre, Arnaud was not able to change his melee weapon instantly by selecting another from the weapon wheel, but could set a default primary weapon, which now ranged from swords to spears to heavy axes and even rifles. With free running gaining an ascent and descent button meant that players could now parkour their way down from buildings instead of scouring the streets for a haystack. Buildings now had explorable interiors, offering players places to hide and treasure to loot, and for the first time in the series, players could now crouch down to sneak, which made stealth gameplay much better. Fleeing from hordes of guards now left behind a ghostly silhouette of Arnaud's last known position when players broke their line of sight, and could be used to lure guards to their position. As Arnaud had a lower concentration of First Civilization DNA than his Brotherhood counterparts, his version of Eagle Vision was dubbed Eagle Pulse and acted much more like a sonar vision that let him see through walls, ceilings, and floors, but only lasted for a limited amount of time before having to recharge. The Hidden Blade also received an upgrade with the Phantom Blade, which now shot projectile blades as well as poison darts. Side quests were now Paris stories and offered mysteries for players to uncover and gain rewards from. With the new leveling system in Unity, missions and memory sequences were rated with a 5-star system. They warned players with lower levels and lower tier gear to upgrade them or level up before playing. Skills such as lockpicking and double assassinations could be unlocked with skill points gained from completing these missions. Taking cues from earlier multiplayer iterations gave Unity's co-op with modes that allowed players to free run around Paris or take on specific co-op missions that awarded players with particular gear and upgrades. Unity's co-op gave players abilities such as sharing the effects of medicine, longer durations for Eagle Pulse, and disguises that will fool the AI into thinking you were a random NPC. Similar to the customization from earlier games in the series, players could now customize each aspect of Arno's outfit, equipping different hoods, belts, and robes, which had different stats and complemented different playstyles. This also meant that gear that provided Arno with better health or higher stealth wouldn't look the best and would clash with the looks of the rest of the equipment that Arno had on. With memory sequences and missions structured in the new black box style, players could now approach and complete them in various approaches, with some hiding context-specific cutscenes. In addition to it, the black box structure gave optional objectives, which players could complete to make the final assassination of a target that much easier. This also meant that the series' previous tailing missions were now better, as it allowed players to search and tail their targets' routes should they lose sight of them instead of immediately desynchronizing. Unfortunately, things didn't go as smoothly as Ubisoft intended. As with the initial launch, Unity was plagued with meme-worthy bugs, unresponsive crowds, and heaps of controversy, especially among its co-op. The team behind Unity originally wanted to allow players to choose their co-op gender, but was abandoned due to Ubisoft's push to release alongside Rogue. Creative director Alex Amancio explained that it would add a substantial amount of production work due to the doubling on voice work, assets, and animations, which would cause an uproar among many old and hardcore fans. Even 3's animation director mocked the statement, as he states that it would take at least a day or two to complete the animations and would not require a replacement of multiple assets. Ubisoft's response also proved to be lackluster, as they claimed that their focus was on Arno and told fans to look forward to playable female characters in later games. However, this was not the only controversy that the game faced during Unity's launch. Ubisoft had promoted a companion app for mobile and locked many legacy outfits behind it, which they would later simply add to the game as unlockable items rather than having players download a separate app on their phone. Even the accents in the game were deemed odd and bizarre by many players, as French characters would speak with an English accent and would take players out of the immersion. An authentic French accent was apparently deemed unnecessary by the team, and for some players to play the game in French with subtitles to escape the bizarrely British accents that the characters had. A novel under the same title would also be released that year. With the many bugs and glitches Unity suffered, Ubisoft ultimately refunded many players and offered the game's Dead Kings DLC for free. It would take at least a year's worth of patches to stabilize the game to be somewhat playable. However, even today, many bugs and optimization glitches across all platforms can still be found, despite the many issues and controversies that Unity brought up, which worried many about the series becoming worn out. Ubisoft would still proceed the following year with Assassin's Creed Syndicate.
The creed of the Assassin Brotherhood teaches us that nothing is forbidden to us. Once, I thought that meant we were free to do as we would, to pursue our ideals no matter the cost. I understand now. Not a grant of permission, the creed is a warning. Ideals too easily give way to dogma. Dogma becomes fanaticism. No higher power sits in judgment of us. No supreme being watches to punish us for our sins. In the end, only we ourselves can guard against our obsessions. Only we can decide whether the road we walk carries too high a toll. We believe ourselves redeemers, avengers, saviors. We make war on those who oppose us, and they in turn make war on us. We dream of leaving our stamp upon the world. Even as we give our lives in a conflict that will be recorded in no history book. All that we do, all that we are, begins and ends with ourselves.
Handled by Ubisoft Quebec, the 9th main installment in the franchise, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, saw the Fry twins, Jacob and Evie, at the peak of the Industrial Revolution in London. This setting would prove to be a bad pick, as given the time period, the buildings were simply too tall for a single person to scale realistically, so the team decided to implement a rope launcher, a device which would allow the player to zipline across buildings that were clearly too far apart or buildings that were too tall to parkour in an efficient manner. and while some newer fans of this series liked the idea of the rope launcher, older and hardcore fans saw it as a handicap to the parkour gameplay. With such a modern setting, the inclusion of a revolver and drivable carriages would modernize the series along with their focus of three main pillars: stealth, traversal, and combat. The only addition to stealth gameplay was the inclusion of a whistle function, which bizarrely enough was not present in Unity, and interactable environments in which players could use tools such as the throwing knife to create distractions. Bringing back a Brotherhood system which had been absent since 3, players can recruit members which they find in various boroughs throughout London to the Rooks and call them to assist them whenever they'd like. Given that the setting did not allow for weapons to be carried about openly, the weapons were far more concealed, with the sword being hidden within a cane, brass knuckles being equipped when combat was engaged, as well as the kukri, a short machete from the British India aspect of the Empire. Combat would also be reworked in Unity to a more fast-paced one that simply looked, played and felt unrealistic and was comically bad. Drivable carriages also doubled as bounty transport, in which players could engage in contracts that would see either Fry Twin kidnap a target and bring them back alive, rather than outright assassinating them for a higher reward. Syndicate would also go on to remove the co-op or any multiplayer feature, as the team claimed they wanted to focus on the single player experience. Using a more stable version of the Anvil Next 2.0 engine showed how Unity could have been if Ubisoft had provided it with an extra year of development instead of rushing it out. However, given London's scale was 30% larger than Paris, larger crowds would be reduced to several bystanders on the sidewalk, and thus made London feel not as vibrant as Paris was. Eagle Pulse was another mechanic that was removed and altered back to the standard Eagle vision from previous titles. Its story, on the other hand, would make a mockery of the series, and longtime fans feel as though Syndicate was merely a parody of the franchise and not canonical.
The sanitary inspector. This man is dead.
I'll free London from Starrick. You have my word.
And my looks.
Miss Fry, your passion is inspiring.
We'll take care of it.
Yeah, you might be able to use this.
Oh God, I hope so.
I'm sure you can put this to better use than I can.
Oh, what's this, Greenie? Assassin Christmas. Since Henry isn't here, I thought you might enjoy the company.
I don't require any company, and Mr. Green is following up on some leads of his own.
Oh yes, Mr. Green. That's a fascinating idea. Oh please, Mr. Green, come and take a look at this book and stand oh so close to me, Mr. Green.
I do not.
What a prick.
Months leading up to Syndicate's launch, however, Quebec promised for a more flushed up modern day than that of Unity's passive video transmissions from Bishop. Still, fans of the modern day would be more than disappointed when it released. 2015's modern day once again put players in the shoes of another anonymous Helix initiate who is contacted by Bishop and told to relive the memories of Jacob and Evie Fry as Sean and Rebecca attempt to locate the Shroud of Eden in London. Fans of the comics would be treated to a surprise when Master Assassin Galina Voronina would show up in the modern day's final moments to assist Sean and Rebecca in securing the Shroud before Otzobert and Violet da Costa would get their hands on it. Even with Sean's successful assassination of Isabel Ardan, Abstergo's head of historical research, Rebecca would be critically injured. The Shroud would land in the hands of Dr. Alvaro Gramatica, Abstergo's head scientist in the Phoenix Project, which would attempt to clone a copy of an issue before it is revealed that several members of the modern-day Templar, including Violet, would be involved in the Instruments of the First Will, a cult dedicated to the resurrection and return of Juno. However, this would be the last time players would see Juno in any mainline game in the series, as Ubisoft would take her narrative and complete it in the Uprising comic. The DLCs of Syndicate would prove itself to be much worse than the base game, as both The Last Maharaja and Jack the Ripper would be considered boring and bland. The Last Maharaja would be set between the events of Syndicate and would see the Fry twins aiding Duleep Singh in reclaiming his heritage. The latter would go further, set 20 years after the base game, seeing Evie return to London after spending time in India with Henry Green, would have Jacob be captured by Jack, a boy in which the twins would help raise after the death of his mother left him without a family. The DLC would bring additions such as non-lethal fear tools to frighten crowds and daze enemies, coupled with the ridiculous events which led to the Fry twins taking over the entirety of London in 6 months, the barrage of poorly written dialogue, and forced historical figure introductions throughout the plot among various other misconceptions such as the inability to leap off rooftops should the game deem it unsafe, and the game being as unstable and unoptimized as Unity, led poor sales figures and Ubisoft to reconsider the fate of the franchise. A novel titled Underworld would also serve as a recap of the entirety of Syndicate and would be released following the game's launch. Announcing that there wouldn't be a mainline game in 2016, Ubisoft would partner with 20th Century Fox and have Justin Kurzel direct the Assassin's Creed movie. Starring the likes of Michael Fassbender, Marion Collan, and Jeremy Irons, the film would have Callum Lynch taken in by Sophia Ricken.
Well, Riken is the CEO of Abstergo Industries.
It's Ricken, not Riken, daughter of Alan Ricken, and forced into the Animus 4.0 to relive the memories of his ancestor, Aguilar de Nerja, during the Spanish Inquisition. Although the initial reception of the movie was liked by some critics, many fans would grow to hate it as it contradicted many lore elements in the games. For instance, Callum was able to speak to his dead mother through the bleeding effect at the end of the movie, which fans agreed was not how it worked. And despite taking place in the same universe as the games, Abstergo seemed oblivious to the Apple and the First Civilization despite knowing and obtaining various pieces of Eden throughout the years. And given that the Helix allows Abstergo to view the memories of people's ancestors by obtaining a sample of their DNA, making it more baffling why they had to kidnap Callum to relive it. Surprisingly, several deleted scenes showed cameos for Baptiste, Xiao Yun, Yusuf Tazim, and Duncan Walpole, including Callum being a descendant of Arno, all being cut for the theatrical release. Plans for a sequel initially began after the production for the first movie had wrapped up, but was cancelled in late 2019 after Disney acquired Fox. A prequel novel titled Heresy, which followed modern-day high-ranking Templar Simon Hathaway exploring the memories of his ancestor, Joan of Arc, as well as the novelization of the movie, would both be released and written by Christy Golden. Despite being a spin-off, Assassin's Creed Chronicles was a trilogy of 2.5D side-scrolling platformers developed by Climax Studio, comprising of China, India, and Russia. Each game in the trilogy focused on the likes of Xiao Yun, Arbas Mir, and Nikolaj Orelov, and this is still the only game in the series to date to utilize the Unreal Engine 3. After being in beta since 2014, Assassin's Creed Identity would be released for iPhone on February of 2016, with Android getting released in May of that year. Developed by Ubisoft Blue Byte, Identity would be a pay-to-win RPG on mobile that sees players creating their own assassin and set sometime after the events of Brotherhood, with returning characters such as Ezio and Machiavelli. Identity would also be another in the series to utilize the Unity engine. Remastering games from 2 The Revelations, the Ezio Collection would come to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One with better lighting and textures, including all DLC from each game, but without any of the multiplayer features. The Ezio Collection would also come with Lineage and Embers, both short films serving as a prequel to Ezio's adventure and the ending of it. Upon its release, Polygon would be the first to point out a bizarrely looking NPC in the background of the opening in 2. Which would be debunked and disregarded as Ubisoft simply not doing enough to call it a proper remaster. However, it was clarified that the collection was only a port to then current gen consoles and only had newer shaders and lightings, which drew out the apparent age of the game, and randomization of NPC textures that the game had even on the PS3 and Xbox 360. A year went by without a main game in the series, and by E3 of 2017 at the Microsoft conference, Assassin's Creed Origins would be revealed to the world. Developed by Ubisoft Montreal with Ashraf Ismail, Origins would serve as a soft reboot to the franchise and feature the origins of the Assassin Brotherhood. Using the newly reworked Anvil Next engine, Origins would be set in ancient Egypt near the end of the Ptolemaic period, the furthest that the series had gone to before, and follow Bayek of Siwa, a Magi, who were historically a desert ranger police that operated under the Pharaoh. Due to the nature of the setting, history books would prove not to suffice as references, and the Montreal team would bring in historians such as Maxime Durat to fill in blanks that records could not. Sarah Schachner, who previously composed for Black Flag and Unity, would return, and the extra year of development would prove to the game's overall quality. Rebuilding the navigation pillar of the series, Origins is the first in the franchise to rid of the minimap and incorporate a compass. However, In an attempt to rectify the mistakes in the parkour mechanics of previous titles, the parkour in Origins would be deemed far too simplistic, as players would only have to hold on a single button or tilt a single joystick to traverse buildings and land, as every surface was now climbable. Eagle vision would also receive a rework with a literal controllable eagle called Senu, which has only been seen once with Connor's daughter in the Reflections comic. Taking inspiration from RPG benchmarks such as The Witcher and Horizon, Origins would incorporate many RPG elements from those games, such as a full skill tree with a proper leveling system that expanded along with the existing crafting system. Outfits and mounts would also only be cosmetic based, meaning that players could now utilize the gear that they wanted with better stats, all while looking good. Overhauling the combat system in Origins, players could now access a range of weaponry from shields to bows and different swords, spears and maces. As a bonus, players could now toggle Bayek's hood on or off, as well as having multiple save files. A fast forwarding of the game's time was also added as an ability that players could unlock, making missions easier to tackle by shifting to a particular time for better stealth. While Origins was a single player focused experience, some of the multiplayer features were included, such as the findings of another player's corpse, which would be represented by a fallen assassin, which players could take on as a quest to exact revenge. Being a complete surprise to fans, a playable modern day returned with its new protagonist, Layla Hassan, a historical researcher at Abstergo. She had developed an animus after being rejected by Sophia Ricken to join the Animus Project, and was attempting to prove the worth of her new animus by reliving Bayek's memories, which had been lost to a tomb in Egypt. The return of playable modern day hit many references to previous titles in the series, as well as the aftermath of the events in the 2016 movie. While Layla's dialogue was considered to be cringy by many, and the story bland and uninteresting, did not take away from the fact that players could finally experience the modern day from a proper protagonist rather than an anonymous ones of previous entries. And with the return of William Miles after his apparent death in Rogue, fans were eager to see what laid in store for Layla.
Those don't need to be your last words.
Who the fuck are you? Ugh!
Does the name William Miles ring a bell?
Assassin?
Then you know who I am.
Aside from the formation of the Assassin's Brotherhood, players were introduced to the Proto-Templars, called the Order of Ancients, as well as various notable figures from the series, such as Emunet, Brutus, and the famed finger sacrifice tradition of the Hidden Blade. However, content such as the explanation of Bayek's Eagle Vision, as well as countless legacy outfits, were ultimately cut from the game, would go on to sell very well and would be received favourably by both critics and fans alike, and would receive 2 DLCs in the coming months. The first DLC, Curse of the Pharaohs, would see Bayek travel Thebes after sightings of an ancient curse harming innocents were noted to be due to grave robbers that had uncovered a piece of Eden. The second, set 4 years after the events of the base game, The Hidden Ones, would shed more light on the rise of the Brotherhood in the Sinai Peninsula region. Both DLCs would complement Origins, with one focusing on the mythical aspects of Egypt, while the other on the assassins. An educational discovery tool was also added later on, which would replace the series' database structure by letting players learn about Egypt as any character in the game. Despite having multiple editions from the Ordinary to the Deluxe, Gold, and even Gods, Ubisoft would lock many weapons, mounts, and outfits behind a microtransaction wall that many disliked, as despite players having the Season Pass, or even the most expensive edition of the game, it still meant that players would have to shell out to obtain gear that should have been included in it. Ubisoft would avoid making any statements on the matter and would continue to roll out armor and weapon packs on the in-game store. Origins would also receive a prequel novelization by Oliver Bowden and would showcase Bayek learning from his father, as well as his first meeting with Aya under the name Desert Oath. Dubbed Rogue Remastered, Ubisoft announced that the remaster would improve on the graphics for current-gen consoles and include all DLC from the original. However, upon release, fans and critics alike were quick to point out that this remaster was simply a 4K supported version of the original and did not do anything to consider it more than a port. Released as another mobile game, Assassin's Creed Rebellion is a strategy RPG that follows the Spanish Brotherhood under Aguilar de Neja during the Spanish Inquisition. The game features other assassins such as Xiao Yun, Ezio, along with 30 different characters that players can mix and match in their team. Although free to play, the game would rely heavily on microtransactions and force its chibi art style graphics at players for Helix credits, which serve no purpose other than to speed up the game and unlock exclusive cosmetic items. Despite Ubisoft stating that the franchise would not return to a yearly release cycle, Assassin's Creed Odyssey would be announced the following year, with the company saying that it was merely coincidental. Originally titled Odyssey: An Assassin's Creed Adventure, Assassin's Creed Odyssey was meant to be a spin-off title, following the likes of Solo, a Star Wars story, but was pushed by Ubisoft to be the 11th mainline installment in the series. Developed by Quebec, Odyssey would be set during the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece, where players are placed in the role of Cassandra, a Mystios mercenary who attempts to reunite her family after the cult of Cosmos, who were the predecessors to the Order of Ancients, had torn her and her sibling Alexios apart. While the game attended to bandwagon of the industry trend at the time of allowing players to select characters' gender, Odyssey's developers had stated that Cassandra was the only one that was canon, and the writer's explanation for a DNA having multiple genders was invalid, which was further reinforced by the novel of the same name by Gordon Doherty. And given that it was developed by Ubisoft Quebec, it was no wonder the game was as bad as it was. Using the same engine as Origins, Odyssey's recreation of ancient Greece was somehow uglier, with its copied and pasted towns and cities throughout a map that was somehow larger but emptier than its predecessor, as well as being historically inaccurate with its mammoth-sized statues. Its lackluster environments, as well as its vacant NPCs, would contribute to the inert atmosphere of Greece that for some reason remove any world interactions from previous titles. Odyssey would also go on to remove shields entirely and focus on faster paced combat, similar to what the team did in Syndicate, but would enable enemy scaling, which was a feature in Origins at all times. This only made combat extremely long-winded and unnecessarily repetitive, as enemies were now damage sponges and no longer proved to be a real threat to players. The removal of the hidden blade was written off as Cassandra being a mercenary instead of a proper assassin, while the team decided to make Cassandra a descendant of King Leonidas and wield his spear as an artifact of the Isu. It simply was not enough to counter the loss of such an iconic weapon in the series. On that note, the return of the Leap of Faith also contradicted the law, as it was invented by the grandfather of Bayek in Origins, and was taught to him by his father when he became a Magi, as a method to control one's fear, which he implemented into the Brotherhood.
What did your father say?
Jump. Don't think so long. Jump.
Yes, Papa.
Trust me. You can.
I do. I will.
Jump then. Come back. You're not ready.
I can do it, Papa. I can.
The inclusion of such a mechanic, as well as the removal of fall damage, only devalued and stripped back its meaning in the grand scope of the lore. Wanting to make Cassandra into a demigod-like being, the artifact was used to explain the superpowered abilities that Cassandra had. This was just a MacGuffin, and a deus ex machina, which is to say it didn't contradict the lore of artifacts from the first civilization, but was used instead as a narrative support for seemingly lazy writing, as players could access superhuman abilities all with a single piece of Eden. Copying RPG benchmarks from the likes of The Witcher and Elder Scrolls, Odyssey integrated dialogue options and multiple endings, which contradicted a lot with how memory worked, as well as the player not being able to change the events of history. While dialogue options and branching storylines would prove to be hollow and empty with zero consequences on the choices of the player, the novelization of Odyssey would state the canon choices and events would occur. The return of naval gameplay was a clear-cut copy and paste of Black Flag and Rogue, although its shanties aren't quite as fun or unique as them. Copying the Nemesis system from the Shadow of Colossus, Odyssey's implementation of its mercenary system proved to be an unenjoyable and grindy one at that, with each mercenary merely being a mix and match clone of each other, and being easily avoidable as long as the players paid off their bounty in the menu. However, the one expansion that was improved on was the cultist system. In Origins, the Order of Ancients system was very linear and had its targets in specific locations at all times. Odyssey's cult system improved on that by allowing players to track their targets as they move about in the world before taking them out to collect pieces of armor which they could wear once they had taken out a section of them. However, these targets would be limited in their development by text on screen and were one too many across Greece, along with the hundreds and thousands of forts with mindless side objectives for players to complete. The removal of confessions and the memory corridor, which was done so due to the game taking so long to load with it, only added to the worsening reputation of the game. And while cutscenes were computer generated, they looked and played in a clunky and unpolished manner, and given that the voice actors had very little to work with, which resulted in dialogue falling flat and unemotional. Despite the Flight, who had previously composed for Horizon Zero Dawn, Odyssey would mainly utilize its main theme, which was based on Ezio's family, by blaring it at every single moment in the game and disregarding the rest of the soundtrack that the duo had worked on. In the modern day, a year after Layla's encounter with William, she's now the head of an assassin cell comprising of Victoria Bebu, Kiyoshi Takakura, and Elena Ryan, all of which are from various comics and are making their first appearance in a game, is scouring the globe for the burial site of the Spear of Leonidas, after discovering the writings of Herodotus about Cassandra interacting with several ancient artifacts. She then boards the Altair II and travels to the island of Santorini, where Cassandra is found to still be alive due to her use of the Staff of Hermes. Players are also introduced to another Isu named Alethea, who warns Layla of the impending doom that Desmond only succeeded in delaying. Included in the Season Pass, Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered was released as a standalone game for the Xbox One, PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. As a remaster, the game featured enhanced graphics, support for 4K HDR, improved lighting and textures, better models, which for some reason made faces smoother and less detailed than the original. The gameplay was also altered to bring it in line with games from 2019. Players could now free aim weapons, something which was oddly missing in the original but was present onwards. The movement of proper tier controls was now back on the top right hand corner, as well as view directions for enemies on the minimap. A polished weaponry which was more similar to the demo that initially had it until it was altered to a menu. Along with low profile, double assassinations were now included, a feature which, again, was oddly not in the original, and more legacy outfits. Crowd density was also increased, allowing for more social stealth. However, fans were expecting Connor's final speech, which was in the Forsaken novel, that was cut to be included in the remaster, but it was not.
Mother, Father, I am sorry. I have failed you both. I made a promise to protect our people. I thought if I could stop the Templars, if I could keep the revolution free from their influence, that those I supported would do what was right. They did, I suppose, do what was right for them. As for you, Father, I thought I might unite us, that we would forget the past and forge a better future. In time, I believed you could be made to see the world as I did, to understand. But it was just a dream. This too I should have known. Were we not meant to live in peace then? Is that it? Are we born to argue? To fight? So many voices, each demanding something else. It has been hard at times, but never harder than today. To see all I worked for, perverted, discarded, forgotten. You would say I have described the whole of history, Father. Are you smiling then? Hoping I might speak the words you long to hear? To validate you? To say that all along you were right? I will not. Even now, faced as I am with the truth of your cold words, I refuse, because I believe things can still change. I may never succeed. The assassins may struggle another 1,000 years in vain, but we will not stop. Compromise. That is what everyone has insisted upon. And so I have learned it. But differently than most, I think. I realize now that it will take time, that the road ahead is long and shrouded in darkness. It is a road that will not always take me where I wish to go, and I doubt I will live to see its end. But I will travel down it nonetheless. For at my side walks hope, In the face of all that insists I turn back, I carry on. This is my compromise.
This remaster would be considered to be the most that Ubisoft had done in the remaster of a game, instead of merely porting titles over to current gen consoles and calling them remasters. Following the base game, Odyssey followed the structure of Origins in terms of having a mythical and an assassin-based narrative. The first of those DLCs was the Legacy of the First Blade, which Quebec got a different writer from EA to write them, which only contributed to the inconsistencies in the plot and errors in lore. Those primarily being sloppy writing, historical inaccuracies with time when the pyramids were being built by 1,000 years, and forced sexuality on Cassandra, which offended the LGBT+ community and forced them to issue an apology and alter the cutscenes and dialogue options. Worst of all, Darius, the first person to utilize the hidden blade in the assassination of King Xerxes, was turned into an assassin in the DLC despite having no connections to them and was dressed like them, having a hideout similar to the Brotherhood despite the Brotherhood not being formed until Bayek, and performing the leap of faith before its creation, clearly shows Ubisoft utilizing the series' iconograph for the sake of recognition at the expense of a character and narrative development. At the end of Legacy of the First Blade, it is revealed that Aya is a descendant of Cassandra, which contradicts Origins, as I did not have a high concentration, if any at all, of first Civ DNA, which was shown when she was unable to activate the apple in Origins. As for the second DLC, The Fate of Atlantis, made a mockery and showed a blatant disregard for Greek mythology as well as the lore by claiming Aletheia had created a simulation of Atlantis in which the Isu had lived in to teach Layla how to control the staff of Hermes through Cassandra. All while this was happening, Layla was being corrupted by the staff, which had been seen before with the Apple and Al-Mualim as well as Abbas. However, this was not appropriately conveyed and made sequences that were meant to be impactful come off as hilarious and cringy.
I can handle it. You're not acting like yourself. You're acting like a child. Look at you. Can't you see what the staff is doing? Plugging into Themos' memories. Letting you run rogue in the underworld? It's the bleeding effect. It's hurting you. You need to stop. Give it back, now. No. It's me or the staff. You have to choose. Let go! It's not worth it. This is for your own. Get up, Victoria. Victoria? No.
There must be some mistake.
Wanna know my favorite thing about the staff?
Don't gloat.
It's the immortality.
Petty to the end.
The thing is, Mr. Berg, I don't care if you live or die. You just gotta get out of my way. Face it, Templar's lost.
An error in the lore was the misconception of the Sixth Sense, which was and always has been the first civilization's ability to view and read time, which was explained in Origins as to how the Isu were able to leave messages for humans. In the DLC, the Sixth Sense was stated as knowledge, which was taken literally from Brotherhood, as at the time Juno was clearly stating that the knowledge of the Sixth Sense was inaccessible to humans.
100 years I might speak and still you would not know us. You with 5 senses, us with 6. The one we kept from you, to be safe. Now you can never know, only try. Grasp. You can see, smell, taste, touch, hear. Knowledge has been locked away.
All of this showed that the company and the team at Quebec, disregarding negative feedback and constructive criticism that disagreed with them by simply removing them and blocking them, no longer cared for the series and was only taking its lore to use for contrived purposes, only to tag the brand name on it and sell more copies to casual players while disregarding long-time fans. What's worse is that the lack of a lore overseer to keep the series narrative coordinated, as several developers from Odyssey have since come out to state that they were not given a clear vision of a roadmap for the series due to Amar Zazia leaving the brand as the head of the franchise to be a transmedia and business development director, and had to utilize Wikipedia as a source for the series' history and lore. As an Assassin's Creed game, Odyssey has broken 8 of the 10 creative commandments set by the original team, which had been followed by nearly every single entry in the franchise up till it, which is the most a game in the series has ever done, and making it somewhat confusing game. As an RPG, it would be regarded as a loss of identity and a bandwagon for industry trends without innovating and merely copying and cloning other games that have more care and effort put into such a skeleton of a game. Odyssey would also be the final game which led to many leaving the series for other franchises, deeming it dead. Following Odyssey's failure, Ubisoft released the Rebel Collection for Nintendo Switch. Porting over Black Flag, Freedom Cry, and Rogue to the handheld hybrid seemed to show the company's direction for the series is to bring all the titles to other platforms. Announced by Ubisoft Montreal, it was finally revealed that Ashraf Ismail and Darby McDevitt will return to Assassin's Creed with Valhalla, along with the legendary Jasper Kidd and Sarah Schachner. Set in Norway of the 19th century AD, players will be introduced to Eivor, a Norse Vikingman that travels with his clan to England, which comes into contact with the leader of the Saxons, King Alfred the Great. Finally, bring back the Hidden Blade. Valhalla is set to bring back the historical accuracy of the series as well as social stealth, and aims to reunite the now divided fanbase, with Darby taking dialogue options and choices to fit a more coherent personality than what was seen with Cassandra, in which the actions and choices made aren't reflected in scripted cutscenes and narrative points. Based on interviews and breakdowns, both Ash and Darby seem to be taking Valhalla in a similar approach as they did with Black Flag, with Eivor joining the assassins at a later point in the game after being introduced to them in the beginning. Wanting to depict the Vikings in a historically accurate manner, the team has stated that they would move away from the simple, brutal portrayal of the Norsemen. Other features such as settlement building, naval with Viking longships for traversal, and raids are set to be in the game. However, the Xbox event in May received a substantial amount of backlash, with Xbox and Ubisoft falsely claiming that the gameplay for Valhalla would be revealed. Still, fans were met with a gameplay trailer rather than what was advertised. This backlash would be wrongly targeted at Ashraf and Darby, with the entire team apologizing for the reveal, but would be unjustified as they had zero control over the marketing material. Seeing as Valhalla would release sometime this year, only time will tell if the franchise could rise once more.